Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The sun-dappled forests of McDowell County, West Virginia, hold countless secrets beneath their ancient canopies. You have captured the collective unease of locals, quite like the case that unfolded in the winter of 1952, a case that even today remains spoken of only in hushed tones among the oldest residents of these isolated mountain communities. What began as a simple missing persons report would spiral into one of the most perplexing investigations in Appalachian history, one that would reveal how isolation and silence can become the most dangerous forces of all. The story of the Blackwood sisters would come to embody everything that makes these mountains both beautiful and terrifying: isolation, resilience, and the weight of unspoken truths. It was December 7, 1952, when a local mail carrier named Thomas Whitley made his routine delivery to the Blackwood property, a modest two-story farmhouse situated on nearly 20 acres of heavily wooded land, approximately 7 miles from the nearest town of Welch. The property sat nestled in a narrow valley, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became nearly impassable during the harsh Appalachian winters. The Blackwood sisters, Eleanor and Margaret, aged 32 and 29 respectively, had lived alone on the property since their parents' passing some 5 years prior. According to Whitley's statement to the McDowell County Sheriff's Department, he knew something was amiss when he found the sisters' mailbox overflowing with nearly 2 weeks' worth of uncollected correspondence. This was, in his words, highly unusual for the Blackwood women, who kept to themselves but were meticulous about their affairs. Whitley had known the Blackwood family since his youth. His father had worked alongside Howard Blackwood in the mines before the accident that had left the latter permanently injured. There was a connection between the families, not friendship exactly, but the kind of respectful familiarity that develops in small communities where lives inevitably intersect. This connection made Whitley more attuned to the sisters' habits than most in the community. "Something felt wrong the moment I turned onto their drive," Whitley later told investigators. "The place had a stillness to it that wasn't natural. Even in winter, that house always had smoke coming from the chimney, curtains moving in the windows, some sign of life. But that day, it was like looking at a photograph of a house rather than a home where people lived." What Whitley found upon approaching the house would become the first page in a case file that would remain open for over a decade. The front door stood partially ajar despite the bitter December cold. A kettle sat on the wood-burning stove, the water long since evaporated, leaving only scorched metal. On the kitchen table, 2 cups of tea, untouched, the liquid within them frozen solid in the unheated house. "It looked like they'd been interrupted," Whitley observed, "like they'd been in the middle of an ordinary moment when something extraordinary happened." This observation would prove more significant than anyone realized at the time. The mail carrier's initial response was to call out for the sisters, moving cautiously through the ground floor of the house. The parlor, with its well-worn furniture and modest decorations, appeared undisturbed. Family photographs in simple wooden frames lined the mantel above the cold fireplace. Books sat neatly arranged on shelves built by Howard Blackwood himself, according to local lore. Whitley described feeling increasingly uneasy as he moved through the silent house. "I kept expecting to find them," he said, "maybe ill in bed or hurt from a fall. I never expected to find nothing at all." This nothingness, this complete absence, would become the central mystery that haunted the investigation from that day forward. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle, no blood, no bodies, just an empty house that felt, as Whitley would later tell investigators, like someone had simply stepped out for a moment and intended to return. But the Blackwood sisters never did return, and the circumstances of their disappearance would confound law enforcement, fascinate amateur sleuths, and terrify locals for decades to come. Before we delve deeper into the events that unfolded after their disappearance, it's important to understand who Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood were, and the peculiar life they had carved out for themselves in their remote mountain home. The Blackwood family had deep roots in McDowell County, stretching back to the early 1800s, when the first coal mines began to appear in the region. Howard Blackwood, the sisters' father, had worked as a manager at one of the larger mining operations near Welch until a mining accident in 1939 left him with a severe limp and chronic pain. Their mother, Vivian, had been a school teacher until the birth of her daughters, after which she devoted herself entirely to their upbringing and education. The sisters had been raised in relative isolation even before their parents' deaths. The remote location of their home and their mother's decision to homeschool them had limited their interaction with the wider community. Eleanor, the elder sister, had briefly attended the local high school but withdrew after less than a year, reportedly due to her father's deteriorating health and need for care. According to school records uncovered during the investigation, Eleanor had been an exceptional student with particular aptitude for mathematics and natural sciences. Her teachers had noted her quiet demeanor, but also her intense focus and remarkable retention of information. One teacher's comment, preserved in the county education archives, described her as possessing a mind like a steel trap. Once something goes in, it never escapes. Margaret, by contrast, had never attended formal schooling. Everything she learned came from her mother's instruction and her own reading. Those who knew the family described Margaret as more outgoing than her sister, more willing to engage with visitors to the property, more visibly emotional. Where Eleanor was analytical and reserved, Margaret was intuitive and expressive. The complementary nature of their personalities perhaps explained the unusually close bond between them that many in the community had observed. By all accounts, the Blackwood sisters had led relatively normal lives until the deaths of their parents, Howard from heart failure in 1947, followed by Vivian just 3 months later from what the death certificate vaguely listed as natural causes. It was after these losses that the sisters' behavior began to change according to the few neighbors who lived within a mile or two of their property. Martha Connolly, who owned the general store in Welch where the sisters purchased their supplies, noted in her interview with investigators that something shifted in those girls after their mama passed. Eleanor, who had always been friendly if reserved, barely spoke above a whisper. And Margaret, well, she started looking at everyone like they might be hiding something. They'd come in together, always together, buy their necessities, and hurry back to that house like they were afraid of what might happen if they stayed away too long. Connolly recalled a specific incident approximately 8 months before the sisters' disappearance that had struck her as particularly unusual. Margaret came to the counter with their usual order: flour, coffee, sugar, the basics. But then she leaned in close and asked if I'd noticed anyone unusual in town, anyone who seemed to be watching them. When I told her no, she nodded like that confirmed something for her. Then she said, "The house feels different lately, like it's breathing when we're not looking." I thought it was just grief talking, but looking back, I wonder if they knew something was wrong even then. Another community member, Franklin Mercer, who operated the local hardware store, reported that Eleanor had purchased an unusual number of locks and door reinforcements in the months leading up to their disappearance. She bought 3 new deadbolts in October alone, Mercer told investigators, said the old ones were sticking. But those Blackwood doors had solid hardware. Howard always saw to that. Never knew them to have trouble before. These small changes in behavior, increased vigilance, growing isolation, apparent paranoia, painted a picture of 2 women who might have had reason to fear something or someone in the months before they vanished. Yet they never reported any specific threats to local authorities, never sought help from neighbors, never explicitly stated what, if anything, they feared. The sisters had no close friends that authorities could locate, no regular visitors to the property, no church membership despite the prevalence of faith communities throughout the region. Their isolation was nearly complete, broken only by their twice-monthly trips into town for supplies. What made their case particularly challenging for investigators was the complete absence of anyone who could provide meaningful insight into their daily lives, routines, or potential conflicts. The Blackwood sisters existed on the periphery of their community, visible but unknown, present but apart. This isolation would prove to be the first of many obstacles for Sheriff James Hardin and his small department as they attempted to piece together what had happened to Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood. Sheriff Hardin was a practical man with nearly 20 years in law enforcement, most of it spent in McDowell County. He approached the Blackwood case with the methodical thoroughness that had become his trademark, beginning with a comprehensive search of the property and surrounding areas. The initial search revealed little beyond what Thomas Whitley had already observed. The sisters' modest wardrobes appeared intact, though a precise inventory was impossible without knowing exactly what they had owned. A small amount of cash, approximately $47, was found in a tin box in Eleanor's bedroom dresser. Their father's hunting rifle remained mounted above the fireplace. Their mother's silver hairbrush still sat on her vanity in the main bedroom, which Eleanor had apparently claimed after her mother's passing. "Nothing about this feels like two women planning to leave," Hardin noted in his initial report. "No packed bags, no empty drawers, no withdrawn savings. It has all the appearances of a temporary absence except for the frozen tea and the open door in December, which no mountain resident would leave that way willingly." The exterior search was hampered by a heavy snowfall that had begun the night before Whitley discovered the sisters' absence, and continued for 2 days afterward. By the time investigators began examining the property grounds, any footprints or other evidence that might have existed had been obscured. The dense forest that surrounded the house was searched in expanding grids, but the winter conditions made this effort difficult and ultimately fruitless. The only potential lead came from the basement, where investigators found a locked wooden chest. When forced open, it contained what appeared to be journal entries written on loose sheets of paper in what was later confirmed to be Margaret's handwriting. However, these entries were fragmentary, often cryptic, and provided more questions than answers. One entry, dated approximately 3 months before the disappearance, read, "E says she hears it again at night. I tell her it's just the house settling, but she says it sounds like breathing, like someone trying very hard to breathe quietly, but not quite managing it. I don't hear anything, but I've started taking the kettle to bed with me, just in case." Another, dated just 2 weeks before they vanished. "The marks appeared on the back porch again this morning. E says it must be an animal, but what animal leaves such perfectly straight lines? And always in sets of 5. I've started keeping track of when they appear. There's a pattern forming, but I don't understand it yet." The final entry, dated December 5th, presumably just days before their disappearance. E finally admitted what she saw in the woods last month. "I wish she hadn't. Now I can't stop looking for it, too. We've agreed to take turns sleeping, one always awake, one always watching. But what if that's what it wants? To wear us down until we can't think clearly anymore." These cryptic journal fragments sparked a thorough search of the surrounding woods. For 3 days, volunteers from Welch and neighboring communities combed the dense forest that surrounded the Blackwood property. They found nothing, no bodies, no blood trail, no signs of violence or struggle. The forest, thick with pine and oak, revealed none of its secrets. One detail from the search did stand out, however. Approximately half a mile from the house, in a small clearing rarely visited due to its difficult access, through dense underbrush, searchers found a series of unusual markings on several trees. These markings, straight lines grouped in sets of 5, appeared to have been made with a sharp implement, perhaps a knife or chisel. They corresponded eerily to the marks Margaret had mentioned in her journal entry. When questioned about these findings, locals offered various explanations. Some suggested they were trail markers left by hunters, though their unusual pattern and seemingly random placement argued against this interpretation. Others proposed they might be survey markings related to potential mining expansions, but no recent surveys had been conducted in that area, according to county records. A few of the more superstitious locals refused to speculate at all, simply shaking their heads and muttering about old signs and mountain warnings. Sheriff Hardin, faced with limited resources and a lack of concrete evidence pointing to foul play, was forced to consider the possibility that the sisters had simply left of their own accord. Perhaps the isolation had finally become too much. Perhaps they had received news that required immediate departure. Perhaps they had planned their disappearance deliberately, though no one could offer a compelling reason why they would do so. This theory gained traction when a bus station attendant in Charleston, nearly 2 hours away, came forward claiming he might have seen two women matching the Blackwood sisters' descriptions boarding a bus to Cincinnati 3 days after they were last seen at their home. However, this lead, like so many others that would follow, ultimately led nowhere. Bus company records showed no tickets purchased under the Blackwood name, and without photographs of the sisters, who had apparently avoided being photographed for years, positive identification was impossible. The investigation continued through the winter of 1952 and into the spring of 1953, but with each passing week, the trail grew colder. Sheriff Hardin's department, with its limited resources and manpower, could not sustain an intensive investigation indefinitely. Other cases demanded attention. The mysterious disappearance of the Blackwood sisters gradually shifted from active investigation to occasional follow-up as new information, increasingly rare, came to light. As weeks stretched into months with no new leads, the case of the Blackwood sisters might have faded into obscurity, becoming just another rural mystery lost to time and indifference. But in the summer of 1953, approximately 7 months after their disappearance, something occurred that would reignite interest in their case and take the investigation in a disturbing new direction. A geology student from West Virginia University named Robert Caldwell was conducting research on coal seam formations in McDowell County. With permission from local authorities, he had been exploring some of the abandoned mining tunnels that honeycomb the region. In one such tunnel, part of the very same mining operation where Howard Blackwood had once worked, Caldwell made a discovery that would become central to the mystery. The tunnel in question had been officially closed since 1945, when that particular seam was deemed exhausted. It had been partially collapsed in some areas, requiring Caldwell to navigate carefully as he collected samples and documented the geological features. In his academic paper, subsequently published in the Journal of Appalachian Geology, he described what happened. Having proceeded approximately 800 meters into the eastern tunnel, I encountered a section where the original mining operation appeared to have broken through into a natural cave system. This intersection of man-made and natural underground structures created an unusual acoustic environment where sound seemed to carry and distort in unexpected ways. It was while documenting this phenomenon that I noticed something unusual in a small side chamber that had been deliberately sealed with mining debris and marked with warning signs indicating potential instability. Caldwell's scientific curiosity led him to investigate this sealed chamber, a decision he would later describe as feeling simultaneously forbidden and necessary, as though I was being drawn toward something significant. What he found inside would dramatically alter the trajectory of the Blackwood investigation. Deep within the tunnel, in this small chamber that appeared to have been deliberately sealed off with rocks and mining debris, Caldwell found a collection of items that were later confirmed to have belonged to the Blackwood family. A woman's shoe that matched the description of footwear known to belong to Eleanor, a silver locket containing a small photograph of who investigators presumed to be the sisters, as young girls with their parents, and most disturbingly, a leather-bound ledger containing entries written in Howard Blackwood's distinctive handwriting. The discovery of these items in an abandoned mine tunnel nearly 5 miles from the Blackwood property raised immediate questions. How had they gotten there? Why would personal effects from the Blackwood home be hidden in a sealed chamber in a disused mine? And most pressingly, what connection might this have to the sisters' disappearance? Caldwell immediately reported his findings to local authorities, who in turn contacted Sheriff Hardin. The items were carefully collected and documented, then brought to the sheriff's office for examination. The shoe and locket were eventually confirmed to belong to the Blackwood family through interviews with Martha Connolly and others who had known them well enough to identify personal items. But it was the ledger that provided the most significant breakthrough in understanding the mystery surrounding the Blackwood family. The ledger, which spanned the years 1939 to 1947, appeared to be a personal journal rather than mining records, as one might have expected. The entries began around the time of Howard's accident and continued until just days before his death. While many entries dealt with mundane matters, weather conditions, household expenses, his ongoing pain from the mining injury, others hinted at something deeply troubling. An entry from 1942 read, "V. says I must stop telling the girls about what happened down there. She says it gives them nightmares, but they need to understand. They need to be prepared. The company men think they buried it deep enough, but some things can't be buried. Some things find their way back to the surface no matter how deep you put them." Another from 1944. "Margaret found one of the artifacts today while playing near the old East Tunnel entrance. I took it from her and returned it to where it belongs. She asked too many questions. She's always been the curious one. Too curious sometimes. I fear what will happen when I'm no longer here to protect them from the truth." And most disturbingly, an entry dated just 1 week before his death in 1947. "They're watching the house now. I see them at the edge of the woods. V says I'm imagining things, that it's the pain medication affecting my mind. But I know what I see. They're waiting for me to die. They know I'm the only one who remembers what the company did, the only one who knows where all the bodies are buried." These cryptic journal entries transformed the investigation. What had been treated as a missing persons case now took on darker implications. Sheriff Hardin, recognizing that the case might extend beyond his department's capabilities, requested assistance from the state police. A new investigator, Lieutenant Samuel Crawford, was assigned to review all evidence and pursue fresh leads. Crawford was an outsider to McDowell County, a fact that proved both advantageous and challenging as he took over the investigation. He brought fresh perspective and was unburdened by the personal connections and local politics that sometimes complicated Hardin's work. However, he also lacked the deep understanding of the community and its history that locals possessed. "My first impression of the case was that we were dealing with something more complex than a simple disappearance," Crawford later wrote in his personal notes, which were discovered among his effects after his own disappearance in 1968. The journal entries suggested a connection to events in 1939, events that clearly continued to haunt Howard Blackwood until his death. Understanding what happened then seemed crucial to understanding what might have happened to his daughters 13 years later. Crawford's first action was to investigate Howard Blackwood's employment records and the history of the mine where he had worked. What he discovered painted a troubling picture of industrial negligence and possible corporate malfeasance. In 1939, the year of Howard's accident, there had been a major collapse in one of the primary tunnels. Official records indicated that 3 miners had died in this incident. However, Crawford uncovered newspaper accounts suggesting the death toll might have been significantly higher, possibly as many as 15 men. Moreover, there were inconsistencies in how the company had reported the incident to state mining authorities. A small article in the Welch Daily News, dated September 12, 1939, noted, "Rescue efforts continue at the Eastern Star mining operation following yesterday's tragic collapse. While 3 local men have been confirmed deceased, concerns grow for several others still unaccounted for." A follow-up article 3 days later mentioned only the funerals of the 3 confirmed victims, with no further reference to the missing men. When Crawford attempted to access the company's internal records regarding the collapse, he encountered resistance. The mining operation had changed ownership twice since 1939, and the current owners claimed Many historical records had been lost during these transitions. Whether this was genuine administrative oversight or deliberate obfuscation remained unclear. What was clear, however, was that Howard Blackwood's accident had occurred during the rescue efforts following this collapse, and based on his journal entries, he had witnessed something during those desperate hours that had haunted him for the remaining years of his life. Crawford's investigation also revealed that in the months before her death, Vivian Blackwood had consulted with a lawyer in Charleston regarding potential legal action against the mining company. The nature of this action was not specified in the attorney's notes, which were protected by client confidentiality. The attorney had since passed away, leaving another dead end. However, Crawford did manage to locate the attorney's widow, who remembered Vivian Blackwood's visits to their home. "That poor woman was terrified," she told Crawford. "Not just worried or anxious, genuinely terrified. My husband wouldn't discuss the details of her case, of course, but I remember him saying it was one of the strangest situations he'd encountered in 30 years of practice." He was still researching precedents when she passed away so suddenly. The widow's recollection added another layer to the growing suspicion that the Blackwood family had been involved in something more complicated and potentially dangerous than anyone had initially supposed. It suggested that Vivian's death, officially attributed to natural causes, might warrant closer examination. Crawford attempted to have Vivian Blackwood's body exhumed for modern autopsy, but his request was denied by county officials, citing respect for the deceased and lack of compelling evidence suggesting foul play. This decision, like so many others Crawford encountered, seemed to reflect a community-wide reluctance to disturb certain aspects of the past. As Crawford delved deeper into the history of the Blackwood family and their connection to the mine, local attitudes toward the investigation began to shift. What had initially been a community united in concern for two missing women was becoming increasingly fractured. Many longtime residents, many of whom depended on the mines for their livelihoods, grew reticent when questioned about the 1939 collapse or the Blackwood family. This tension came to a head in January 1954 when Crawford arranged a public meeting at the Welch Courthouse to appeal for new information. Attendance was sparse, and those who did attend seemed more interested in emphasizing that the sisters had always been odd and kept to themselves than in offering substantive assistance. One elderly attendee, who requested anonymity in Crawford's report, approached him after the meeting with a warning. "You're digging into things that were put to rest a long time ago, mister. Some truths are like those old mine shafts, liable to collapse on anyone who ventures too deep." Despite these challenges, Crawford continued his investigation, focusing increasingly on the mine itself. With proper authorization, he organized a thorough exploration of the tunnel where Caldwell had found the Blackwood artifacts. This exploration revealed something the geology student had missed: a narrow passage, partially concealed behind mining equipment, that led to a natural cave system extending beneath the Blackwood property. The passage had been deliberately obscured, covered with boards painted to match the surrounding rock, and concealed behind a rusted ore cart that appeared to have been abandoned in place decades earlier. Only Crawford's methodical, inch-by-inch examination of the tunnel revealed its existence. This discovery suggested a physical connection between the mine where Howard Blackwood had worked and the land where his daughters had lived and disappeared. It raised the possibility that whatever had happened to Eleanor and Margaret might be directly connected to whatever their father had witnessed or discovered during his time in the mines. In his official report, Crawford wrote, "The existence of this hidden passage indicates deliberate effort to conceal access to the cave system. Such effort implies knowledge of something valuable or significant within these natural formations, something worth hiding. Given the connection to both the mining operation and the Blackwood property, it seems increasingly likely that the disappearance of the sisters is linked to whatever secret this passage was designed to protect." Crawford led a team through these natural tunnels, mapping their extent and searching for any sign of the missing women. The cave system was extensive, with numerous branches and chambers, some showing signs of human modification from decades earlier. In one such chamber, approximately half a mile from the mine entrance and directly beneath the Blackwood property, Crawford's team found a disturbing tableau. The chamber, roughly 20 feet in diameter, contained the remnants of what appeared to be some kind of living space. A cot with moldering blankets, shelves carved into the rock walls, holding canned goods and water containers, a kerosene lamp, and most significantly, a wooden chair facing the far wall, where dozens, perhaps hundreds of photographs had been affixed to the rock surface. These photographs, many faded and water-damaged, spanned decades. Some appeared to date back to the early 1900s, while others were more recent. They depicted various locations throughout McDowell County: storefronts in Welch, mining operations, private homes, church gatherings, and in many of these images, faces had been carefully circled in red ink. Among these photographs, Crawford found several showing the Blackwood sisters at various ages. In each, their faces were not circled, but rather marked with a distinct X. The most recent photograph, showing the sisters standing on the porch of their home, was dated in the corner, November 1952, just weeks before their disappearance. The methodical organization of these images suggests long-term surveillance, Crawford noted. The distinction between circled faces and those marked with X's implies some sort of categorization system, perhaps identifying different types of targets or priorities. The inclusion of the Blackwood sisters among these marked individuals strongly suggests they were specific objects of interest to whoever created this disturbing display. The chamber also contained a desk fashioned from wooden crates with a surface worn smooth from apparent years of use. In the desk's single drawer, Crawford's team discovered a collection of newspaper clippings related to unexplained disappearances throughout McDowell County dating back to 1940. Many of these cases had received minimal attention: itinerant workers, solitary hunters, isolated elderly residents, people whose absence might not immediately trigger alarm. What connected these disparate cases was their proximity to the mining operation where Howard Blackwood had worked, and the fact that none had ever been solved. Bodies were never recovered. Investigations yielded no suspects. The missing simply vanished, eventually forgotten by all but their immediate families and whoever had collected these meticulous records of their disappearances. This underground chamber raised far more questions than it answered. Who had created this space? How long had it been there? What was the significance of the circled and marked faces? And most importantly, what connection did it have to the disappearance of Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood? Crawford's report, filed in February 1954, noted, "The existence of this chamber suggests premeditation and long-term surveillance of the Blackwood sisters and others in the community. The level of organization and the apparent duration of this surveillance indicate we are not dealing with a crime of opportunity or sudden passion, but rather something calculated and patient." The chamber's location beneath the Blackwood property cannot be coincidental. The discovery prompted a renewed search of the Blackwood house and surrounding property. This time, investigators found something they had previously overlooked: a trapdoor in the floor of the tool shed concealed beneath heavy equipment that led to a narrow passage. This passage, as they would soon confirm, connected directly to the cave system and the chamber with the photographs. The trapdoor had been ingeniously disguised. The tool shed's floor consisted of rough wooden planks laid directly on the earth. The trapdoor section had been constructed to include a layer of soil on its upper surface, making it appear identical to the surrounding floor when closed. Only by systematically testing every inch of the floor by applying pressure did investigators locate the hidden access point. This physical link between the house and the underground chamber transformed the investigation once again. It now appeared that someone had been accessing the Blackwood property from below, potentially for years, without the knowledge of Eleanor and Margaret, or perhaps more disturbingly, with their knowledge. The implications of this discovery are profoundly unsettling, Crawford wrote. Either the sisters were unaware that someone could access their property at will through this hidden passage, a thought that raises questions about their safety and privacy over an extended period, or they were aware of it, which raises equally troubling questions about their potential involvement in whatever activities were conducted in the underground chamber. As winter gave way to spring in 1954, the investigation continued along two parallel tracks. Crawford focused on the underground chamber and its contents, attempting to identify the individuals in the photographs and establish connections between them. Meanwhile, Sheriff Hardin continued pursuing more traditional leads, interviewing and re-interviewing locals who might have had contact with the sisters in their final days. It was one such interview that provided the next significant breakthrough. Martha Connolly, the general store owner, who had previously spoken with investigators, came forward with information she had initially withheld. According to Connolly, approximately 1 month before their disappearance, Margaret Blackwood had come to the store alone, something she had never done before. She had appeared distressed and had whispered to Connolly, "If something happens to us, look in the mining records from '39. Look for the names that aren't there." When asked why she hadn't shared this information earlier, Connolly admitted she had been afraid. Her late husband had worked for the same mining company, and she feared repercussions if she became involved in anything that might damage the company's reputation. Now, however, with the investigation gaining national attention through newspaper coverage, she felt compelled to come forward. "I should have said something sooner," Connolly told Crawford, "but you have to understand how things work in a mining town. The company owns everything. The houses, the store leases, the jobs. Cross them, and you might find yourself with nothing. But I can't keep quiet anymore, not after what I've been hearing about those poor girls and what might have happened to them." This cryptic message sent Crawford back to the mining records from 1939. He had already reviewed the official casualty list from the collapse. 3 names, all local men with families in the area. But Margaret's message suggested there were other victims, ones who had not been officially acknowledged. Crawford began searching for employment records rather than accident reports, comparing staff rosters from before and after the collapse. This painstaking process revealed something troubling. Approximately 20 men who had been on the company payroll in the months before the accident no longer appeared afterward. Only 3 were listed as deceased due to the collapse. The others simply vanished from the records. These missing men shared one significant characteristic: none were local to McDowell County. They were itinerant workers, many without families, who had come to West Virginia during the mining boom, men whose disappearances might go unquestioned or unnoticed in the chaos following a mining disaster. "The pattern is unmistakable," Crawford noted in his investigation files. These men, outsiders with few or no local connections, effectively ceased to exist in official records following the collapse. No transfer notices, no termination records, no death certificates. It's as though the company deliberately erased them from the narrative of what happened that day. This discovery lent credence to Howard Blackwood's cryptic journal entries about where all the bodies are buried, and the company burying it deep enough. It suggested that the 1939 collapse might have been more than an accident. It might have concealed something the company wanted hidden. As Crawford pursued this angle, tensions in the community continued to escalate. In April 1954, the tool shed on the Blackwood property was destroyed in a fire that investigators determined was deliberately set. The entrance to the tunnel was collapsed, cutting off easy access to the underground chamber. Crawford received anonymous threats urging him to abandon his investigation. One such threat, left on the windshield of his vehicle while he interviewed a former miner in Welch, read simply, "Some secrets stay buried in these mountains. Outsiders who dig too deep get buried too." The note was written on company letterhead from the mining operation, an unmistakable message about who opposed his efforts. Despite these intimidation tactics, Crawford persisted. He obtained a court order allowing him to access sealed company records, stored in a Charleston law firm's archives. These records included internal communications following the 1939 collapse, communications that had never been made public. What these documents revealed was deeply disturbing. In the weeks before the collapse, several miners had reported unusual findings in the eastern tunnels, geological formations that didn't match expected coal seam patterns. The company had brought in outside specialists to examine these formations. These specialists, whose credentials were vague in the documentation, had spent several weeks conducting undisclosed research activities in the sealed section where the collapse would later occur. Internal memos expressed concern about potential archaeological significance and the need for complete discretion regarding artifacts recovered from Level 3. One memo dated just 5 days before the collapse noted, Dr. P advises immediate shutdown of eastern tunnels pending complete evaluation. Management has declined this recommendation, citing production quotas. Dr. P has registered formal protest. The collapse occurred 3 days after this memo. All records of what had been found, what research had been conducted, and who exactly Dr. P was, had apparently been lost or deliberately destroyed in the aftermath. A particularly revealing document found tucked between other papers, as though someone had intended to remove it but overlooked it, contained a partial transcript of a meeting between company executives and government officials shortly after the collapse. The document was damaged, with sections illegible, but certain passages stood out with disturbing clarity. Acosta, significance of the discovery cannot be overstated. If verified, it would fundamentally alter our understanding of national security implications require absolute confidentiality. The public narrative must remain focused on the industrial accident aspect. The artifacts secured and transported to facility illegible for further study. Site has been permanently sealed with all evidence of the witnesses have been dealt with. The 3 casualties provide sufficient cover for operations. Remaining personnel have accepted financial incentives for their cooperation and relocation. Based on these documents, Crawford formed a theory. The mining operation had uncovered something significant, perhaps archaeologically or geologically valuable, in the eastern tunnels. Rather than halt operations for proper study, which would have impacted production and profits, management had continued mining activities. This decision had led directly to the collapse that killed not just the 3 acknowledged victims, but potentially many more. Howard Blackwood, as a manager involved in the rescue efforts, would have known the truth. His subsequent demotion to administrative duties and his eventual departure from the company could be seen as either a consequence of his injuries or, more sinisterly, as a way to sideline someone with dangerous knowledge. This theory explained some aspects of the mystery, but it still didn't address the most pressing question. What had happened to Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood in December 1952? How did their disappearance connect to events that had occurred 13 years earlier? The answer began to emerge in the summer of 1954, when Crawford's team finally managed to clear the collapsed entrance to the underground chamber and resume their examination of its contents. Behind the wall of photographs, previously hidden from view, they discovered a metal container. Inside were dozens of cassette recordings, carefully labeled with dates spanning from 1947 to 1952. These recordings, made on a portable device found alongside the tapes, contained hundreds of hours of audio surveillance of the Blackwood house. Someone had been systematically monitoring the sisters, recording their conversations, movements, and daily activities for years. Most of the recordings captured mundane domestic sounds and conversations. The sisters discussing household chores, Eleanor reading aloud from scientific journals while Margaret worked on mending clothes, their occasional disagreements about how to manage the property, the rhythms and routines of their isolated lives captured in intimate detail, but interspersed throughout were monologues by a male voice, a voice that none of the investigators could identify. These monologues revealed a mind obsessed with what had happened in 1939 and convinced that the Blackwood sisters were somehow key to exposing or concealing the truth. In one recording from 1950, the voice stated, "They don't know what their father protected them from. They don't understand what lies beneath their feet. But they will. When the time is right, they'll become the keepers of the secret, just as he was. Willing or unwilling, they have a role to play." Another from early 1952. "Eleanor suspects something. She's been examining her father's papers, asking questions in town about the old mining accident. She's getting too close. Margaret still doesn't see it, but she follows her sister in all things. They'll either become allies or obstacles. I need to determine which before proceeding." And most chillingly, a recording dated November 30th, 1952, just days before the sisters vanished. "It's time they've found the passage. Eleanor discovered the entrance last night while storing preserves in the root cellar." I watched through the gaps in the floorboards as realization dawned on her face. She knows the house has never been truly theirs alone. By morning, they'll have found the chamber. They'll have seen the photographs. They'll understand their father's warnings at last. And then they'll make their choice, join in protecting the secret, or become part of it. The voice in these recordings was educated, articulate, and utterly convinced of the righteousness of its mission. It spoke of duty and sacred trust in protecting whatever had been discovered in 1939. It referred occasionally to the others who shared this mission, suggesting that the speaker was not acting alone, but as part of some organized effort. In a recording from 1951, the voice stated, "The company believes everything is contained. The government is satisfied with their cover story, and the locals have learned not to ask questions. Only we know the truth. Only we understand what was awakened in those tunnels and what would happen if that knowledge became public." Howard understood in the end. He made his peace with the necessity of our work. His daughters must do the same. These recordings strongly suggested that someone, presumably the unidentified male voice, had been living beneath the Blackwood property, monitoring the sisters through hidden access points, perhaps for years. This individual appeared to be connected to the 1939 mining incident and believed the sisters had inherited some obligation or knowledge from their father. But the recordings stopped abruptly on December 1st, 1952. Whatever happened after Eleanor discovered the passage remained unrecorded. Crawford's theory, outlined in a confidential report to the state police commissioner, proposed that the sisters had discovered they were being watched, confronted the individual responsible, and subsequently either fled in fear or were forcibly taken, or perhaps even willingly went, with this person to some unknown location. The evidence suggests a complex situation, beyond a simple abduction, Crawford wrote. The lack of signs of struggle at the house, combined with the sisters' apparent growing awareness of something amiss in the months before their disappearance, raises the possibility that they might have been prepared for whatever occurred that December night. Whether that preparation led them to flee, to fight, or to acquiesce remains unknown. In August 1954, nearly 2 years after the Blackwood sisters' disappearance, the most significant breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former miner named Joseph Reeves, who had worked at the same operation as Howard Blackwood during the 1939 collapse, but had since relocated to Ohio, contacted Crawford after reading about the investigation in a newspaper. Reeves claimed to have been part of the rescue team alongside Blackwood. According to his account, what they found in the collapsed eastern tunnel wasn't just fallen rock and trapped miners. They found a chamber, a large natural cavity that the mining operation had broken into, and inside this chamber were artifacts unlike anything they had seen before. "It wasn't Indian stuff," Reeves told Crawford. "Wasn't anything I recognized. There were stone tablets with markings that looked like writing, but not any alphabet I'd ever seen. There were figures carved from some kind of bone, human-like, but wrong somehow, proportions all distorted. And there was a pit in the center of the chamber, perfectly circular, that seemed to go down forever. We lowered a lantern on 100 feet of rope and never saw it hit bottom. Reeves described how the initial rescue team, including himself and Howard Blackwood, had been quickly replaced by company officials and unknown men in suits who took control of the site. The original team was separated, questioned individually, and required to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of termination and legal action. According to Reeves, the company executives who arrived on site immediately ordered the chamber sealed and swore everyone present to secrecy. The official story would be that the collapse had claimed only 3 lives, local men whose deaths could be verified by the community. The other victims, the itinerant workers whose bodies were never recovered, were effectively erased. They told us it was a matter of national security, Reeves explained, said the government had been consulted and wanted everything kept quiet. They paid us all a bonus to keep our mouths shut. Most of us were just glad to keep our jobs during those hard times. But Howard Blackwood, according to Reeves, had been deeply troubled by what they found and by the company's response. Howard kept saying those artifacts should be in a museum, that scientists should study them. He thought they might be evidence of some ancient civilization that predated anything we knew about. The company men just wanted it all buried and forgotten. When asked why he was coming forward now after all these years, Reeves said simply, "I'm dying. Cancer? Got maybe 6 months left according to the doctors. I've kept this secret for 15 years and it's eaten at me. Those missing men had families somewhere, even if not here. And those Blackwood girls, whatever happened to them, it's connected to what we found down there. I can't take this to my grave, not when it might help find them." Reeves's testimony provided crucial context for Howard Blackwood's cryptic journal entries and his daughter's eventual fate. It suggested that whatever had been discovered in 1939 had remained a point of conflict between Blackwood and his former employers for years afterward. Crawford attempted to locate other members of the original rescue team, but his efforts were largely unsuccessful. Most had died, moved away without leaving forwarding addresses, or refused to speak about the incident. The wall of silence surrounding the 1939 collapse remained largely intact despite Reeves's testimony. With this new information, Crawford revisited the underground chamber beneath the Blackwood property with forensic specialists. A more thorough examination of the space revealed something they had missed initially: a narrow crevice behind one of the rock shelves, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. This crevice led to another chamber, smaller than the first but equally disturbing in its contents. Here, investigators found clear evidence that someone had been living in this subterranean space for an extended period, perhaps years. They also found a journal belonging to someone who identified himself only as the Keeper. The journal entries described a self-imposed mission to guard what lies below and prevent anyone from reaching the deeper chamber. The writer claimed to have been selected for this duty following the 1939 discovery and had dedicated his life to ensuring that the pit remained sealed and forgotten. I am but one of several assigned to maintain surveillance over potential access points. 1. Entry read: personal belongings, makeshift furniture, food supplies, and a primitive sanitation system all pointed to long-term habitation. The Blackwood property, with its direct connection to the cave system, requires particular attention. Howard's knowledge made him dangerous, but also valuable, a known entity whose movements could be predicted and monitored. His daughters represent both risk and opportunity. Most significantly for the investigation, the final entries in the journal describe the writer's growing concern about Eleanor Blackwood's suspicions and his decision to bring them into the fold or eliminate the threat they pose. The last entry, dated December 6th of 1952, read simply, "It is done. They have made their choice. The secret remains protected for another generation." Despite this ominous statement, there was no physical evidence in either chamber to suggest violence against the Blackwood sisters. No blood, no signs of struggle, no human remains. The mystery of what exactly had happened to Eleanor and Margaret remained unsolved. The journal did, however, contain references to other secured locations and sister sites, where similar surveillance operations were apparently being conducted. These references were vague, often using code names or geographic coordinates that Crawford was unable to fully decipher. They suggested that whatever had begun in the mine in 1939 had expanded into a larger operation involving multiple locations and personnel. By late 1954, the investigation had reached an impasse. Crawford had uncovered a bizarre conspiracy centered around whatever had been discovered in the mine in 1939. He had identified a potential suspect in the sisters' disappearance, this self-described keeper who had been living beneath their property. But without a body, without direct evidence of foul play, and without being able to identify or locate this individual, he could not bring the case to any definitive conclusion. Moreover, Crawford faced increasing pressure from both local authorities and state officials to wrap up his investigation. The case had dragged on for nearly 2 years, consuming resources and stirring up uncomfortable questions about corporate accountability and potential cover-ups. The mining company, now operating under new ownership, had powerful allies in state government who were eager to see the matter closed. In November 1954, Crawford received a direct order from his superiors to conclude the investigation within 30 days. The timing of this order, coming shortly after he had submitted a request for resources to explore other locations mentioned in the keeper's journal, struck him as suspicious. In his personal notes, he wrote, "The closer I get to whatever truth lies at the heart of this case, the more resistance I encounter. It's increasingly clear that powerful interests do not want this matter fully resolved." Despite his frustrations, Crawford was a career law enforcement officer who understood the realities of bureaucratic constraints. He spent his final month of authorized investigation time attempting to identify the keeper and locate the Blackwood sisters, but with limited success. He developed several theories about the individual's identity based on educational background and connection to the mining operation, but could never conclusively name a suspect. In December 1954, Lieutenant Crawford submitted his final report, classifying the disappearance of Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood as unresolved due to insufficient evidence. He recommended the case remain open but inactive pending new information. Crawford included all his findings regarding the 1939 mining incident and the apparent conspiracy to conceal whatever had been discovered. However, much of this information was subsequently classified by state authorities and restricted from public access, ostensibly for reasons of public safety and economic stability in the region. Frustrated, but not defeated, Crawford took an unusual step before submitting his final report. He made copies of key documents, photographs of evidence, and duplicates of the most significant audio recordings. These materials, along with his personal notes and theories, he sealed in a waterproof container and concealed in a location known only to him, a precaution against the institutional amnesia he feared would be imposed on the case. For all intents and purposes, the mystery of the Blackwood sisters faded from public consciousness. The property remained abandoned, eventually reclaimed by the county for unpaid taxes. The house fell into disrepair and was ultimately demolished in the early 1960s. The entrance to the cave system was permanently sealed during highway construction in 1965. The story might have ended there, confined to local legend and the dusty archives of unsolved cases. But in 1968, a final, disturbing epilogue emerged. Dr. Samuel Crawford, who had left law enforcement to pursue graduate studies in archaeology at Marshall University, was conducting research on pre-Columbian cultures in the Appalachian region. His academic work had brought him back to McDowell County, where he was documenting indigenous sites that might be affected by planned mining expansions. His choice of research focus was no coincidence. In the years following the official closure of the Blackwood investigation, Crawford had continued to pursue the truth through academic channels. His position as a researcher gave him access to historical and archaeological records that had been unavailable to him as a police investigator. He had published several papers on anomalous archaeological findings in the Appalachian region, though none directly referenced the Blackwood case or the 1939 mining incident. On September 12, 1968, Crawford failed to return from a solo expedition near the former Blackwood property. A search party found his vehicle parked on a Forest Service road, his equipment laid out methodically beside it. A trail of footprints led into the woods toward the overgrown remains of the property. But despite an extensive search involving dozens of volunteers and tracking dogs, Crawford himself was never found. The circumstances of his disappearance bore an eerie resemblance to that of the Blackwood sisters 16 years earlier. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, simply a sudden absence where a person had been. In his vehicle, investigators discovered a sealed envelope addressed to the state police. Inside was a hand-drawn map showing what appeared to be cave systems beneath McDowell County, with a specific area circled in red. A note accompanying the map read, "I believe I've found the original chamber. If I'm not back by nightfall, seal the entrance at these coordinates. Some secrets should remain buried, and if you find them, if you find the sisters, tell them I understand the choice they made." The coordinates led to a previously undocumented cave entrance nearly 2 miles from the former Blackwood property. When authorities investigated, they found the entrance had recently collapsed, making access impossible without major excavation equipment. Given Crawford's ominous warning and the lack of evidence that he had entered this specific cave, no attempt was made to clear the debris. Among Crawford's personal effects, recovered from his university office, was a journal containing entries that suggested he believed he was being watched in the months leading up to his disappearance. One entry, dated just 3 weeks before he vanished, read, "I've seen the markings again, 5 straight lines grouped together. They've appeared on trees near my home, on my office door once when I returned from lunch. Even on the margin of a library book I checked out. Someone knows what I'm looking for. Someone is warning me away, or inviting me deeper." The disappearance of Samuel Crawford became yet another unsolved mystery in the region, unofficially linked to the Blackwood case, but never definitively connected. His academic research, including his notes on pre-Columbian artifacts allegedly discovered in McDowell County mining operations, was collected by university officials and subsequently lost when a campus building suffered flood damage in the early 1970s. A curious postscript to the case emerged in 1972 when a geological survey team working in the area reported finding a metal container hidden in a hollow tree near where Crawford's vehicle had been discovered. The container, severely damaged by exposure to the elements, contained waterlogged papers and photographs that were largely illegible. However, one document remained partially readable, a letter addressed "To whom it may concern," and signed by Samuel Crawford. The surviving fragments of this letter contained tantalizing but ultimately inconclusive references to finding them alive, a community of keepers, and willing participants in something larger than any of us understood. Whether these statements referred to the Blackwood sisters, to other missing persons, or to something else entirely remains unknown. The letter, like so much evidence in this case, raised more questions than it answered. Today, more than 7 decades after Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood vanished from their mountain home, the case remains one of the most perplexing in Appalachian history. The truth, whatever it may be, lies buried beneath layers of time, earth, and deliberate obfuscation. Some local residents maintain that on cold winter nights, particularly in December, the echo of women's voices can be heard in the hollow where the Blackwood house once stood, 2 sisters engaged in eternal conversation, keeping their secrets even in absence. Others insist that strange lights sometimes appear near the sealed cave entrances, moving in patterns too deliberate to be natural phenomena. Most telling, perhaps, is the persistent local superstition that warns against digging too deeply in certain parts of McDowell County. Some things are buried for a reason, the saying goes. Some secrets belong to the mountains alone. The highway that now cuts through what was once Blackwood property has developed an unusual reputation among local drivers. An unusually high number of mechanical failures and unexplained accidents have occurred along a specific quarter-mile stretch. Electronic devices, radios, cell phones, GPS systems often malfunction or lose signal precisely as vehicles pass this section. Some drivers report sudden intense feelings of being watched or hearing whispered voices through their car radios, even when the devices are turned off. County records show that at least 7 different development projects proposed for the surrounding land have been abandoned over the decades, each time after reaching the preliminary survey stage. Companies cite unfavorable geological assessments or prohibitive development costs. But locals note that survey teams often leave the area visibly shaken, unwilling to discuss what they found or experienced. Whether the Blackwood sisters met with foul play at the hands of the keeper, whether they fled to escape his obsessive surveillance, or whether, most disturbing of all, they chose to join him in his self-appointed mission to protect whatever secret lay beneath their property, we may never know. What remains certain is that Eleanor and Margaret Blackwood, like so many who have vanished in these ancient mountains, have become part of the landscape itself. Their story, woven into the complex tapestry of silence, isolation, and unspoken truths that defines Appalachia. Their voices, if they still speak at all, now belong to the deep hollows and mist-shrouded ridges that have witnessed countless similar disappearances throughout their long and secretive history. And perhaps, in the end, that uncertainty is the true horror of the Blackwood case. Not the prospect of violence or death, but the possibility that some choices once made transform us so completely that we can never return to who we once were. That some secrets, once embraced, consume not just our lives, but our very identities. For those who venture into the remote corners of McDowell County, particularly near the overgrown remnants of the Blackwood property, local guides still offer a piece of cautionary advice. Listen to the forest. If you hear what sounds like women whispering, turn back immediately. They're not calling you forward. They're warning you away. Whether this is mere superstition or something more profound remains, like the fate of the Blackwood sisters themselves, a mystery that these mountains seem determined to keep.